Hi, and welcome to lecture number 36. This is topic 3.1, and we're discussing the Reconstruction Amendments. The first of two learning objectives is to explain how Reconstruction Amendments impacted African Americans by defining standards of citizenship. Let's begin by exploring the actual goals of Reconstruction. There were two main goals pursued by the federal government. The first was to reintegrate the former Confederate states, those southern states that seceded from the Union, mounting a rebellion and insurrection against the United States for the purpose of maintaining the system of slavery. Many bore the brunt of the fighting and had its cities and infrastructure destroyed, hence the name Reconstruction. These states now had to be readmitted. The initial plans for Reconstruction were controlled by the president. Abraham Lincoln, before his assassination, had laid out a plan that required 10% of voters in the southern states to pledge loyalty in order to be readmitted to the Union. When President Andrew Johnson took over, he intended to maintain a similar process in which the former Confederate states should be admitted if 10% of the voting population from the 1860 election voted to be readmitted, but with some additional restrictions on paper. For one, any high-ranking Confederate officer or large landholder would be unable to vote after readmission. Despite these restrictions, President Andrew Johnson began issuing many pardons, as many as 7,000, to high-ranking Confederates and large landowners. As a result, many of the individuals who held power before the Civil War were poised to reassume power afterwards. As this pattern continued, Republicans in Congress became dismayed that the progress achieved by the Civil War would be undone by President Johnson and the readmitted former Confederates. The Radical Republicans, a faction within the Republican Party, voted to take control of Reconstruction from the president. They sought to create new reentry requirements and to stop the spread of black codes, which were jeopardizing the progress made in ending slavery. They divided the Confederate states into 5 military districts, each under the control of a Union general. These states would not be readmitted until they ratified the 13th Amendment and later the 14th and 15th Amendments. They were also required to draft new state constitutions that promised to protect the rights of newly freed black Americans. The second major goal of the federal government was to establish and protect the rights of free and formerly enslaved African Americans. They aimed to achieve three things: grant citizenship, ensure equal rights, and provide political representation through the vote. There were also private efforts which sent young women, black and white, to the South to act as nurses and teachers to help newly freed people transition to freedom. The only such organization that was funded by the federal government was the Freedmen's Bureau. Although there were attempts to pass the Civil Rights Act to invalidate the black codes that had been adopted in various southern states, these efforts faced limitations. Legislation could be replaced by any future legislation, so a more permanent solution was sought. This led to the decision to amend the Constitution itself, rather than rely solely on laws that could be overturned or repealed. The first of these amendments is the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery or involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime. This amendment made the words of the Emancipation Proclamation permanent. This was crucial because even after the Civil War ended, there were still border states that were part of the Union and technically allowed slavery. Additionally, there were enslaved people in Indian Territory who remained under the old system of slavery until the federal government could abolish it nationwide. The 13th Amendment was initially successful, but its wording, which allowed involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime, led southern states to pass black codes that criminalized black people. By prosecuting them for petty crimes, they could force them into involuntary servitude. For example, vagrancy laws were enacted, requiring everyone in town, city, or states to have a job. Those found in violation would be jailed, and after being jailed, they were leased out to pay their fines. These laws were selectively enforced against black people across the South, while white people were largely unaffected. Other examples include laws that would force black workers into long-term, exploitative contracts from which they could not easily escape. These laws made it nearly impossible for black individuals to start their own businesses, as the cost of purchasing a business license was prohibitive. Additionally, black people were often forced into low-paying apprenticeships and restricted from engaging in activities such as drinking alcohol, using firearms, hunting, fishing, and grazing livestock, anything that could be used to prosecute them and put them in jail. Once jailed, they were hired out to pay their fines in lieu of serving jail time. The chain gang, depicted in the image on the screen, exemplifies this system where prisoners, often prosecuted for violating black codes, were leased out as laborers to pay off their fines. The ratification of the 13th Amendment was one of the few requirements of Johnson's plan imposed on readmitted southern states, yet there were known ways for states to circumvent compliance with the amendment. The 14th Amendment established the principles of birthright citizenship in the United States. It granted equal protection under the law to all people, asserting that the right to life, liberty, and property could not be taken away from an American citizen without due process of law. This means that any deprivation of these rights must be subjected to legal proceedings. The 14th Amendment overturned the infamous Dred Scott v. Sandford decision, in which Chief Justice Roger Taney had declared that black people in the United States had no rights that white Americans were bound to respect. While the black codes across various states were technically now unconstitutional, they still had to be challenged by states and lower courts to be formally declared unconstitutional. Furthermore, the 14th Amendment was intended to guarantee the right to vote to those who were birthright citizens. It included language stating that any state depriving citizens of the right to vote could lose representation in the federal government. This was a safeguard against the potential increase in Southern states' representation in Congress and the Electoral College, which was now the case because the 3/5 compromise from the Constitutional Convention no longer applied. To prevent Southern states from taking advantage from this new greater representation, while keeping newly freed people from voting, this clause, which threatened the removal of representation, was included in the 14th Amendment. Finally, the 15th Amendment specifically addressed the right to vote, prohibiting the federal government in each state from denying or abridging a citizen's right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment ensured that no one could be denied the right to vote due to these factors. The necessity of the 15th Amendment was not limited to the South, as black men in northern and western states were still denied the right to vote even after the Civil War. However, despite its passage, Southern states employed poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to prevent African Americans from exercising their new voting rights. These restrictive laws included grandfather clauses, which exempted white Americans from the same restrictions. The 15th Amendment notably excluded women despite their early advocacy for abolition, leading to tensions between abolitionists and women's rights activists. This exclusion would later inspire the women's suffrage movement, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920. Now let's move on to the second learning objective, explaining how the 15th Amendment impacted African Americans' participation in American politics. The most straightforward way to understand this is that as more black people were allowed to vote, they exercised that right, leading to the election of more black representatives. Many of those who voted were formerly enslaved, and many of those elected to office were generally from the North, middle class, and had a college education. There were also formerly enslaved individuals elected to office, some of whom were illiterate. One notable example is Thomas Mundy Peterson, who is believed to be the first African American to cast a ballot after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, doing so in a city election to reconstitute the city's charter in New Jersey. Some historians consider the 15th Amendment to be a second birth of the nation, and even a greater revolution than that of 1776, as it made the country's promise of a representative government more real. However, despite the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, the dismantling of these rights began early, in 1875 when the Supreme Court decided in the case U.S. v. Reese. In this case, the court began to narrowly interpret the 15th Amendment, ruling that while it prevented racial discrimination in voting, it did not automatically grant the rights to vote to everyone. This allowed for race-neutral limitations, such as poll taxes and literacy tests, to be legally permissible. During the Reconstruction era, approximately 2,000 African Americans served in public office, from city councils to state legislatures, the U.S. House of Representatives, and even as high as the U.S. Senate. Some of the most famous black legislators were Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, who served as U.S. Senators for the state of Mississippi. Remarkably, they occupied the same Senate seat that Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, held before the Civil War. States with a majority black population, such as South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, were the ones that elected most of these black office holders. Unfortunately, many of the rights gained during Reconstruction were later eroded during the Jim Crow era. The rise of organizations like the KKK and the White League, which employed violence and intimidation, further suppressed African Americans' rights, particularly the right to vote. By the late 1870s, violence across various cities and states aimed to oust black office holders and prevent black voters from participating in elections. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, culminating in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was a determined effort to reclaim the rights that had been won and exercised in the early 1870s. And finally, here's the recap. Reconstruction was the process of readmitting the Confederate Southern states and ensuring equal treatment of free black people. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as a punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship rights to all born in the United States. The 15th Amendment prohibited discrimination and access to the vote, however, it did not include women. And more black legislators were elected as a result of the larger black electorate. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.